The acute pain that you experience from an injury, let's say like you fracture a bone or you sprain an ankle or you're in a car accident, that pain is driven by the inflammatory chemicals that's released from the damaged tissue, right? And then after a series of stepwise processes that's really regulated by the immune system, the inflammation dies down, the tissue heals, everybody's happy, it's a simple process, right? But what about chronic pain? What happens there? Shouldn't the inflammation die down? Shouldn't the tissue heal? Let's take a look at what happens with chronic pain. So acute pain is driven by the inflammatory process released by the damaged tissue, right? But similarly, chronic pain is also driven by the inflammatory process, more systemic inflammation, not necessarily due to tissue damage, right? And believe it or not, I know this sounds a little weird, but pain doesn't really correlate that well with tissue damage, which I know is weird, but for example, when you get the flu, you tend to get body aches and pains. And in this case, there's no tissue damage, right? But you feel pain after a hard night of drinking. Maybe you have headaches and body aches. And again, no tissue damage, but lots of pain. Now, estrogen actually has a great anti-inflammatory property about it. So right before a woman's menstrual cycle, when estrogen levels drop, she might feel aches and pains and headaches. Estrogen that's normally anti-inflammatory is severely lacking, so there's more inflammation and more pain. Once again, no tissue damage, but there's pain. It's well established that people feel more pain when they don't sleep well or when they're chronically stressed. Yet again, no tissue damage, but there is pain. So what do these things have in common? Inflammation, right? These examples and many others, like let's say insulin resistance and diabetes, that creates inflammation in the body. Obesity. Fat cells actually create inflammatory chemicals. Poor diet, autoimmune conditions, low-grade infections. There's a large list of these things that create systemic inflammation leading to pain, right? And systemic inflammation is one of the major drivers behind chronic pain. So let's revisit the example of pain associated with tissue damage. Initially, the injury releases inflammatory chemicals, like we talked about, causing nerves to fire and you feel pain. But after a few weeks, the injury should heal, the inflammation should subside, the pain should go away. But what if there's also inflammation from a low-grade infection in the gut or a sinus infection? What if you're a bit overweight, right? Like I said, fat cells secrete a lot of inflammatory chemicals. What if you're under chronic stress, you don't sleep well? What if you have insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes? All of these factors add up, creating so much inflammation that even though the original issue has healed, right, the original injury has healed, you still feel pain. The remnant tissue damage from the original injury wouldn't be enough to cause the nerves to fire, but the added inflammation from these other factors make you feel pain. And it doesn't have to be all of them. It could just be one or two to create inflammation to cause chronic pain, despite the original injury healing. Now, the concept of inflammation creating pain is exemplified with arthritis. Right? You can look at an x-ray and see joint degeneration and bone spurs and all these things on the x-ray. That's the structure, right? But the structure doesn't change day to day, but people's pain sure changes day to day. People with arthritis will feel good some days, they'll feel bad some days, despite the fact that the structure is still the same. And that's because the pain is really driven by inflammatory processes. Maybe they had a bad sleep, maybe they were stressed out, maybe they had something in their diet, maybe they like a gluten sensitivity or a dairy sensitivity that ramped up their inflammation, right? It's well known in the literature that the presence of arthritis on x-rays has a very poor correlation with pain. So again, I'm going to repeat that so there's no misunderstanding. The amount of joint degeneration that you can see on an x-ray has actually a very poor correlation with pain. But what does correlate with pain? If you guessed it, you're right, inflammation. So if this whole concept of chronic pain being driven by inflammation is new to you, I understand how it can come off a little bit strange, but here's the take-home point. If you have chronic pain, whether it's musculoskeletal or otherwise, let's say you have chronic headaches or whatever, but if you have chronic pain, let's say musculoskeletal in this case, and you've been through all the rehab and you've done all your exercises properly and you've stuck with it and you've given it a really good chance, and yet you still have pain, maybe chronic inflammation is the driver behind your pain, and you may want to think about looking at some blood work or talking to us about that aspect of finding the root of the inflammatory process that's going on in the body. Alternatively, if you have, let's say, widespread pain throughout your whole body, like what are the odds that that's tissue damage versus inflammation? It's very likely that it's more inflammatory driven. Or if you have specific areas, but many of them, let's say you have like ankle pain and knee pain and back pain and shoulder pain and headaches, like the odds of that being tissue damage and injury based in all of those problems and they're not going away is much less likely than it being an inflammatory process that's going on in the body. So if you're interested in this, give us a shout. As a functional medicine practitioner, that's what I do. I look at a lot of blood work. We look at your lifestyle. We look at your dietary habits, maybe make some changes here and there to reduce the inflammation, or the blood work, finding out what the root of it is, maybe some supplements, and we try to get to the bottom of what's driving this whole thing. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button on the YouTube channel, and we'll see you next week.